So just a bit of background for those who don't know. Kelly and I are the node leadership team for the Kimberley Marine Research Program, which has been running for the last 5 years. Kelly's been about 500 years. So Kelly's been a consistent person through. I've taken over from Chris Simpson, then completed and myself. We're coming to close of that program towards the end of this year. All the final reports are in. We've got 25 projects within the program, and I'm really pleased to present today. This is probably one of our favourite projects, just because it's one of those ones we're very passionate about. So we've been working with these guys, and it'll be a great course to work with the Kimberley Indigenous Saltwater Science project. And yeah, you're going to hear a lot more about that today. So Dean Mathews from Yawuru, Beck Dobbs from UWA, who's one of the researchers working with them, and Bo Austin from Darwin University and CSI. Thank you. So I'll allow them to tell the story.
Thanks, Stu. Thank you all for making time and effort to come here today. Obviously, we just wanted to gauge who was there yesterday in regards to how much background content. And I think the key of this is around the products that are coming out, and obviously how do they obviously get taken up or implemented into management, and especially around the joint management space with traditional owners in the Kimberley. I was nominated as project leader of this project, but I'm a project leader, a senior project leader in the Yawuru Land and Sea Unit, and over the last 5 years, I've been working closely with the state in the development of the Yawuru Conservation Estate Plans and the Yawuru Marine Park Plan. And that, I suppose, in the last year, working towards the implementation of the Marine Park Plan. And obviously, we're finding, I suppose, there's been some successes and challenges along that process. But hopefully, some of these products will, I suppose, change processes that were currently, undertaken by the department previously. And how do we sort of adjust ourselves around the joint management space with traditional owners in the Kimberley, around, who come from a values-based system, and obviously with Western science through the management of the conservation estates. How does Western science and traditional knowledge come together? How does researchers engage with traditional owners in the Kimberley? And obviously, how do we look at developing some sort of standardized operating procedures around monitoring and evaluation in the Kimberley? So without further ado, I'll just sort of give you. So project timeline, 2012, the initial engagement was traditional owners sort of got off on a bad start, and then sort of fell in a bit of a hole while the other WAMSI projects sort of kicked off. Back in 2015, Patrick Sears again sort of wanted to pick it up. What do we do with the money? So contacted Patrick Dodson at Yawuru, and Yawuru was sort of starting to build that relationship with the department, and obviously, how do we draw the other traditional owners on this journey? So Yawuru were utilising that space, I suppose, to help be the conduit in pulling back the other traditional owners in regards to how do we come together and deliver on some of the products that we might see that are beneficial to us. So I think, full credit to the group. The group met back in 2016 again and agreed to look at implementing the project. I'll take my hat off to the group because we changed obviously the WAMSI 1.5, which is a traditional not TEK, but I suppose the group believed that, KISSP come from the group saying that we believe that we are Kimberley Indigenous people are saltwater scientists in their own right. So hence the name KISSP, Kimberley Indigenous Saltwater Science Project. Because traditional knowledge, we believe that we're a scientist in our own right. So it's that how do the two science come together, knowledge and Western science. Objective one, I think we sort of thought about, preempting what might be coming into Kimberley, tourism, mining, obviously the marine park. So we're a bit smart in developing the products that we could see that'll be a great value coming and of use, I suppose, in that sphere. So objective one was to integrate traditional ecological knowledge and management practice into the Kimberley Marine Conservation and Management. And if you look at the Yawuru conservation plans, we sort of changed the face into how previously those documents were written by the state. Yawuru values sit front and center of those conservation and marine park plans, and they're actually got key performance indicators. So, the cultural values are not lost in regards to the ecological and biodiversity assets that exist within that landscape as well. Objective two is develop a standard and agreed community protocols and research agreement template. to underpin marine research in the Kimberley and implementation strategy to build awareness in the science community of the need of this engagement. So Kimberley people were, I suppose, want to be respected, have respect, and want people to show respect when they enter their country. And we're finding that a lot of science, and there is a lot of marine science in the north. And if you think about the CSIRO, the AIMS, and just the department itself, there are a lot of, I suppose, marine research being undertaken in Kimberley, and traditional owners just want to be respected and have some idea of who's on their country and what are they doing. So you can build those formal partnerships. It's about capacity building and leaving some, I suppose, skills left through that process. So objective 2. Objective 3 was to develop a framework and protocols for standardizing data collection, storage and analysis methodologies that can be used to monitor saltwater country across Kimberley. Looking at how can we develop some standardized operating procedures so we can measure apples against apples in the Kimberley. You know, obviously a lot of data has been collected, but how do we analyze it and put that to use? And this includes the development of a training package for agreed research targets, delivery to rangers, to develop internal capacity of these standardized techniques. They're wanting to build capacity in the groups moving forward. So when a researcher leaves, finishes their research, they leave a legacy of their research is some tools or methodology of the process and the product itself. So groups can keep going on and monitor their country and monitor the change over time. The working group's approach was to, led by the KISSP working group. The group decided that, you know, the best use of the money at the time was to develop an advisory group. Research in the Kimberley is very costly. So when you think about it, the project, I think it was $400,000 assigned to this project. How do you make best use of that $400,000? So, you know, we end up said, well, we'll come here as an advisory group. We'll run, have a secretary to run the background of the project, to do the minutes and the agendas. But also it was sort of to get the rangers and traditional owners to be a part of this process. So the rangers had to take on some responsibilities. So the rangers and RPA coordinators were nominated by the PBCs to be on the reference group. They had some level of, I suppose, not, their engagement was to provide an advisory and not a decision-making process. 7 on-country trips, in total about 103 traditional owners were a part of those trips. Both Bo and Beck went out to a lot of the communities, and if you wanted to talk about that a bit more, but I'm just quite happy to flick through.
That's fine. Yeah, so we had just a number of, we had these workshops. It was 7 on-country workshops because there was 7 groups that are involved in. I think we deleted that slide, but just to let people know that the working group consists of representatives from 7 ranger groups across or Indigenous groups across the Kimberley, and so we were in small airplanes, some 4 drives, and went out and sat down and like Dan was saying, that I'm not sure if you said this bit yet, but each of the representatives and the rangers actually decided how the workshops were going to go ahead. So whether or not it was sitting down on country, or it was all on country, but sitting down out there in the shade, whether it was in what sort of meeting rooms we met in, and also who came to those meetings.
Thanks, Beck. Yeah. So it sort of put a bit of ownership back onto the groups to sort of, you know, think about how they want to structure and run the meetings when the researchers come out on the country. And obviously that was left up to them. And, you know, there's some of those images reflect that, I suppose, that process. We had 2 group workshops, one in 2016, where we pulled all the group back together in Broome, and as the milestones that we need to meet along the way. And then back in 2017, July working group workshop again, and the working group feeding back information to the PBC all the way through. So it was a bit of a conduit. So the information would come back to the working group, and the reference group members would take that information back to their PBCs, and for further endorsement to make sure that they could, what we were developing was in right with the PBC. So it's sort of providing that conduit back all the way through. The research team selection process. So obviously, you know, we developed the objectives, then we submitted expressions of interest for the and art. And obviously, do you guys want to talk about this process, or about how? So we developed the objectives, and then obviously groups that we'd worked with previously. We sort of we thought that might be of interest. Asked them to submit expressions of interest, and then the group picked them based on those merits.
It was one of those really interesting sort of situations where we all flew to Broome to deliver our pitches to the working group, and we were sort of passing each other at the front door of the office as we delivered pitches. We hadn't met each other before, and yeah. So.
And I think it was interesting for us because normally, I mean, with my research, we're either working with groups or going to groups with ideas, and this time it was really, we were the people standing up there saying, why are we the best person for this job and to work for you guys, and what can we deliver to you guys? So yeah. for the first time, and it felt real, you know, it was a great experience, and it was like, oh, okay, this is what it's like.
like someone going for an interview, but it was really good because but I think, you know, at the time people said, oh, be careful because you got 3 different research institutions undertaking different objectives and how do they all align. But I take my hats off to Bo, Beck and Gina. They, you know, for them, they've taken it, you know, this to another, they produced a product that wasn't even a part of the original objective, and they've developed the Navigating the Knowledge Currents document, which is a combination of all of their research. So, you know, full credit to them for them to work across and you know, passionate about their work, and, you know, great to be standing here with them today along this journey, you know, because I think it's a true reflection of collaboration in how research institutions can work with traditional owners. So, yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Well, and I guess from our perspective too, we'd say thanks to the working group because, you know, people who've worked with, researchers who've worked with traditional owners, that if you have a really strong working group that's guiding you, giving you instruction and telling you what are the right things to do, what are the wrong things to do, gives you a lot more confidence as well. So it was really nice from a researcher perspective. Yeah,
and I think a strong part of that is trust, you know, relationships and having trust and knowing researchers. And obviously, Bo, we had some previous work with Bo, you know, in Gubbins, and so that relationship was already there. But, you know, we sort of, Beck went through some water research that she'd done throughout the Kimberley. So it was that already those trust and relationships already established was a key part of this as well. So you just want to, I suppose, so these are the products that come together, and obviously.
So you saw the 3 objectives, and so that was one of the, like Dean touched on that one of the challenges was that we were each working on a different objective, but we really needed to work together to get because really the end result was helping saltwater country people into the future. So how can we develop some products to support that? And so although we were working on each objective, we had to, yeah, like I said, work together, and this is how we sort of, I suppose, visualize, well, put together how our products link to each other. And so we'll talk about them, I think that's coming up next, isn't it? So we'll move into that. But as you can see, so my stuff is on the right-hand side. So I had the objective 3, which is developing a regional saltwater monitoring framework. And Bo's stuff is in the middle. His work was initially about looking at mobilising Indigenous knowledge and also creating some guidelines for model knowledge work, which he'll be talking about. And then what we didn't touch on yesterday, for those that were there, we mentioned it a number of times yesterday, but we'll also, Gina, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, is she on phone link up? Hi, Gina. Well, maybe she can't hear us. Maybe she's going to make a cup of coffee. She's very faint. Her objective 2, which was about developing a collaborative science guide for researchers, and each of those we had to talk to each other, obviously, and then we've come together at the end and as Dean mentioned, produced the Navigating Knowledge Currents report, which is a way forward for all of those products and how to move into the future.
Thanks, Beck. So here we go, mobilising Indigenous knowledge for collaborative management of Kimberley saltwater country. So, well, yep.
All right.
And feel free at any time, if you have any questions specific to slides, we're more than happy for you to jump in and ask. So.
Can I ask a question? Because I was there yesterday and I didn't get the opportunity to ask them. But when you actually talked about the workshops that you actually had, is that the end of the workshops, or can the workshops actually continue from now on?
Well, we hope so. But the project has come to an end. But that's where I suppose our pitch yesterday afternoon at the last session was we believe there's a legacy. There's a strong momentum by the group. I think it's a model that the group, I mean, if you look at how the project started, got off on the wrong foot, but I mean, it is a true, I suppose, reflection to the resilience of the group, the Indigenous people wanting to work with government. So, you know, I take my hat off to the group, the reference group, because it's sort of a new, younger breed of members sitting on there that see the both sides. You know, how do we work together for the betterment? And I think at the end of the day, if we're there for a common objective, there's policy, legislation, and that. But if you look at each of our goals, it's about protecting and managing country. So I think we can get to that end point and see what we're there for. Then I think we can, you know, move forward, I suppose. So if you're looking at the context of joint management by the department and traditional owners, I think it's how do we, work together around that. So I think there is some, in principle, support from the group where we think that there is great opportunity to work with the state and other researchers in regards to marine research around Kimberley country. So there, hopefully we can get some support. And we're sort of trying to develop, I suppose, a business prospectus to sort of go out to other groups to try and, you know, get some support for the continuation of the group.
Cool.
Yeah.
No other questions? Yep. Cool. So yesterday, I see a lot of familiar faces in the room. So it's the same presentation, but I'd really like people to ask some questions anytime through the presentation and have a bit more of a dialogue. And I didn't go into much of the detail of this mobilising Indigenous knowledge approach. So I'll spend a bit more time on that today. So yeah, I guess, an introduction. From Charles Darwin University and CSIRO. I've been working in Northern Australia, mostly Arnhem Land and the Kimberley for around about 10 years now, based in Darwin. Wildlife-based enterprises was what I first started working on. That's where I first met Dean in 2008 or 9 or something like that for my PhD research. Have since moved on to working in, I guess, more of an Indigenous land and sea management space, but particularly looking at monitoring and evaluation and measures of effectiveness of Indigenous land and sea management. Most of my work these days is doing the relationships or doing the bridging between Indigenous knowledges and Western science. So that seems to be what I'm thinking about most at the moment. Yeah. So just to start off, the question of why bother going to the effort of bridging Indigenous knowledge and Western science? Why bother mobilising Indigenous knowledge for collaborations? So there's a few reasons that I think are really useful that there's sort of been a really long argument to mobilise Indigenous knowledges from a rights perspective. And I think that argument is really important. Indigenous people have the right to maintain languages and governance systems and ways of life. But I think that's actually looking at the bare minimum of what are the potential benefits of bringing Indigenous knowledge and Western science together. I think there's a lot more practical benefits, applied benefits, and especially in terms of informing policy and informing decision making that can lead to better decisions, better policy, and better management eventually for Kimberley saltwater country. So, for example, Indigenous knowledge holders can see changes, threats, and connections between things that scientists might not see. Indigenous knowledge is not just a way of communicating information between people, but it's also a way of observing the environment, building knowledge around those observations and communicating it across generations and between different groups. So that process of building Indigenous knowledge is just as important as the content of the Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous people in general see much more of a connection between the environmental, social, cultural, economic and spiritual aspects of country. So I guess in social ecological systems management, which is, I guess, my academic hat that I put on, one of the real struggles for us in Western academia is how do we combine the social and the environmental in a way that leads to sustainable outcomes. Indigenous people have adopted that holistic approach for millennia, literally. So that, I think Indigenous people are really useful guides in helping us to develop some of the solutions going forward for sustainability. I already mentioned the support Indigenous people to look after language, governance systems and ways of life. And we're getting a lot better at being able to bridge or combine Indigenous knowledge and Western science to develop, to co-produce new knowledge and co-produce solutions to problems. And the other thing that we've talked about a lot is just the vast expanse of the Kimberley, and that the Kimberley has probably not seen a lot of Western science research for a whole lot of reasons. It's expensive, it's difficult to get to, all of those sorts of things. But Indigenous people have been doing science, have been producing knowledge about the Kimberley for forever, essentially, effectively. So there is a lot of knowledge that is still practiced in the Kimberley today. And that can be really useful for policymakers in Perth, in Canberra, and wherever it is, and for managers as well.
And just an interesting one, I presented a talk based around the Pope handed down his encyclical paper last year, and it was the water sea, and it was tying exactly that second point, that we must care for Mother Earth. We must have dialogue amongst each other, because we're becoming very siloed, and I think we're losing connection between people and countries. So it was quite interesting that, you know, so I did a talk about what Yawuru were trying to do in regards to that. But if the Pope can, you know, sees that and is saying that all humans must have a common dialogue amongst each other because we're not protecting the Mother Earth, you know, it sort of resonates with that point there about where we come from and how we see country.
And this, I put this slide up with a few quotes from traditional owners that we talked to. And really the point I think that is trying to be made here is that traditional owners are open to incorporating Western science into the way they know and practice country. I think the attitude is probably summed up, which quote is it? The first quote: in a way, science is catching up to our knowledge, particularly in the Kimberley space. Collecting data makes it a bit easier to explain to scientists and put them in our shoes. Where knowledge is missing, science can fill in the gaps. And I think that's a key, that we should start with what's already there. You take a strengths-based approach or an assets-based approach, that there's already a lot of knowledge that's really useful. What are the gaps? What do traditional owners want more information about to help make decisions about country? So we did this process as part of KISSP and of, I guess, to an extent, documenting some of the Indigenous knowledge that exists currently for saltwater country. And we did it with, I guess, being fairly conscious of some of the limitations of doing this. But traditional owners, I think, exercise some good faith in saying, well, we understand that we do need to just remind Western scientists and others, the general public, that we do have a lot of knowledge for country and that it hasn't gone. It's still alive, it's still being practiced. And so we talked to over 100 people about what sorts of knowledge people have, and these are the most common types of knowledge that people talked about. There was a whole range, I don't know, 40 or 50 different examples, and these were just the most talked about. And you can see that these examples really describe knowledge as content. It's the information that can be shared between Indigenous people and others. But it doesn't go into much of the detail around Indigenous knowledge as a process or the belief aspects of the Indigenous knowledge as well. So seasonal indicators, historical knowledge, knowledge of tides and currents, hunting, location of cultural values, sites, boundaries and connections, health indicators, connectivity and risk management on country. And you can see that all of those things, often they're cross-cutting across all of our different disciplines or subject interests and could potentially make a contribution to our partnerships. But of course, there's some serious limitations to this approach. And we kind of knew that there were limitations to this approach. We spend as much time talking about the limitations as the the examples of Indigenous knowledge that we identified. Indigenous people, the traditional owners, reminded us over and over again that Indigenous knowledge is lived. It's living our lives in saltwater, part of Liam Burr. You might want to talk about what.
Yeah, I mean, Leon is a part of the expression of what we feel is the well-being or social and emotional well-being to our connection to country. Each person will have a different measure of that because of obviously the social status or what they might be, I suppose, feel strong about. Some people have totems that they obviously are in charge of and protect, and so it's about that context of connection to country from a well-being and social to the heart sort of feeling. So I think we all as humans got that, but we express it as Leon because of our connection to country. Sometimes Leon might be, if we see country or things that are bad, that'll affect our Leon's well-being. So that's a sort of expression of the well-being indicator.
Yeah, so when you create a list like this, it actually turns these things into Western science objects and has the effect of separating it from Leon and all these other practice aspects of knowledge and beliefs. So we're pretty conscious of that, and we have reported that, but I think it's important to also stake out some space for Indigenous people as serious knowledge holders for saltwater country. So, over the last probably 4 or 5 years, working in the Kimberley and in the Northern Territory in Arnhem Land, we've sort of been talking about these really interesting conversations around how knowledges interact. And this was mostly with work with the Woonamagambra people right up in the north of the Kimberley, and with traditional owners or clan groups around the Arafura swamp in Arnhem Land. And we sort of reached this, one of the, I guess, the metaphors that we came up with was like an optical fiber cable, where you've got multiple different knowledges that sit side by side, but they don't sort of join together or anything like that, but they communicate knowledge. And the more fibers you have, the better picture you get at the other end. We're talking about these sorts of things, trying to figure out how we communicate these sorts of relationships and the work that we do. And some colleagues that I've been working with in the Stockholm Resilience Centre, Maria Tango and a few other people who've been involved in the CBD, Conventional Biological Diversity, and IPBES, Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, kind of the twin of the IPCC, but for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, had published a paper around about the same time as we were talking about our optic fibers. And we looked at it and went, whoa, hang on a minute, this is really similar. And so the basic idea is that on the right-hand side, you've got a whole lot of examples of Western science. You could call them disciplines or different types of knowledge systems, social science, natural science, etc. And on the left-hand side, we've got these other non-scientific knowledge systems, local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, practitioner knowledge, traditional knowledge, etc. You could say fisher knowledge, or you could pick a whole lot of other knowledge systems that people mobilise to be able to know the world. We do it in our everyday lives as well, that aren't scientific, but still produce fairly accurate and usable information to help us make decisions. So you can see that those knowledges sort of move forward, and some, they run in parallel often, some join, some diverge. There's some interaction. And I mean, if you delve into these things far enough, it gets blurry, and the edges of these things get a little bit blurred. But the point is really that if you look at the cross-section that's in the dotted circle called the enriched picture, if we imagine that we're talking about saltwater country, Kimberley saltwater country, if you're mobilising just one of those knowledge systems, you just get one of those dots that tells you a bit about saltwater country. It tells you gives you a little bit of the cross-section. But the more knowledge systems that you can mobilise, the more you can fill in the picture of what saltwater country looks like and how it operates. And so the idea is that we can mobilise all of these different knowledges, either running in parallel or at the start of a research project, we could sit down and Indigenous people and Western scientists could say, oh, well, we think we've got enough trust and good enough relationships that we could do a co-produced project here where we combine Indigenous knowledge and Western science. So, yeah, do you want to talk about it? Or
Yeah,
all good?
Yeah.
All good? Yeah. So then the task in KISSP was to actually make this practical. How do you combine Indigenous knowledge and Western science? And I guess that was one of the objectives. Objective one was integrate Indigenous knowledge and Western science as if it's a job that can be done, in 18 months. But it's actually a process that we describe here, and it's an ongoing process, and we have to adopt some discipline in making sure that we're doing it well. So we came up through the feedback from traditional owners in the workshops. We got some guidelines on how to do collaborative knowledge work, really quite detailed guidelines. We combined that with the multiple evidence-based approach and identified essentially 4 steps in the process. And then under each of those steps, we've got a set of guidelines that really helps people to actually do the work, to engage in the process. And in the report that we've got, each of those points under the steps has a paragraph or 2 going into some detail about how to do it right. I'm talking for too long, as I always do, so I'm not going to go into the detail. And this is just putting up a quick example of we're getting quite good at doing this work, especially with rangers. Rangers are really the experts at doing this collaborative knowledge stuff. I've just put some of the different tools under the Western science. I've got more disciplines rather than tools. Under each of those disciplines, a whole bunch of tools that we can use in our toolbox. I've got the colours there to sort of say, well, in the ranger context, we've got pretty good at implementing Western science approaches, especially in monitoring. We're getting pretty good at doing participatory research tools, but really we're still not mobilising Indigenous knowledges as much as we could be. And that's kind of a missed opportunity at the moment. And Indigenous knowledge in the regional scale. So this part of so Beck will talk about the development of a regional scale monitoring framework. And of course, Indigenous knowledge, when you start to talk outside of the local traditional owner boundaries, it gets really tricky when you're talking about Indigenous knowledge. There are ways to operate at a regional scale using Indigenous knowledge. It just takes some careful conversation and dialogue and the building of trust between traditional owner groups and their partners. So that's really probably the key message that I wanted to give there. And I'm going to hand over to Beck to do Jean's slide today.
All right, so like I said, Jean unfortunately couldn't be here today, but she's listening. So I just wanted to, Jean sort of touched on why this objective was developed and why the working group wanted to see some new guidelines or new protocols around working with Indigenous people in the Kimberley. And I suppose when I first saw the 3 objectives and we put forward those expression of interest, this was one of the ones that I was really interested in. I'm kind of glad that Gina ended up doing it because my background is I've got a research background. I'm employed by the University of Western Australia, mainly in freshwater research in the Kimberley. And I'd spent a few years at that stage working in the Kimberley, well, actually about 8 years when this project started, working in the Kimberley. And this is something that comes up all the time, that as a researcher, you are asked to, as part of all of our, through the university, the guidelines, the protocols are about making sure that you, that when you go into the Kimberley and you're undertaking your research, there's guidelines or protocols how you interact with Indigenous people, but they're written from Western science point of view. And also there's not really any practical tools around how do you actually go about that. So as part of all of our research programs, it was, yes, that we need to include Indigenous people in our research. And I've spent quite a few years of fumbling through how to do that. So for me, this was really exciting that there was going to be a project these guys had thought forward and said, okay, we know that that's something that's difficult for you. It's also something that's difficult for us because we have to tell each researcher every time. So let's get together and produce some protocols around that. And so Gina did a great job with this. So what she came out with. Now, this thing on the right we keep showing, and I remember having a chat to Gina about this initially, and she said it was something that she would hope summed up all of her protocol at the end of her guidelines, but we show it first and up front. And the first time I looked at it, I went, whoa, okay, what is it that we've got to do? But if you've from being somebody that's undertaken research in the Kimberley, I now can look at those, and actually when I read them, I say, yes, that's what we do, but we're doing it naturally. Probably 4 of those steps you skip through and say, yep, that's what we do every time we do that research. But it's just for those people. I think it's really important to have those steps there for those people that haven't worked in the Kimberley region before, because for somebody who's new to the game, but it's also a good reminder for us. We were saying that it would be really good for us to actually go back over these. Now we've developed these guidelines. How did the KISSP project fit into this? Where did we do this process, and have we followed our own guidelines? So that's something that is interesting. It would be really good to go back and do something like that. So what Gina was able to do. It's not on here. Sorry, it is another. I'll just click presentations, end show, and just go over to here. So here we see the guidelines again. And prior to these guidelines, there was a process in the Kimberley whereby if you were doing research in the Kimberley, you went to the Kimberley Land Council originally. That was the first point of call. And there was a REACT process, and that was a research ethics process whereby they had a number of questions that you had to fill out. It was making sure that you'd actually thought about what you were going to do, who you were going to engage with, and also made you think about what your research was going to have benefit for the groups that you were going to work with. Yeah. But I think that
it was
you guys
quite a
realised
timely process too as well. So obviously the REACT is the committee that sometimes non-Indigenous people sit on, and they're representing on behalf of the traditional owner groups of an area where research must go work. So a lot of native title, a lot of the groups, Indigenous people have got native title and are forming their prescribed body corporates. They're wanting people to go to them directly and build that formal relationship. So from that process, we looked at the REACT process, adopted it subtly to make sure that each individual group was quite happy with what they wanted as part of that process. And I think now we have a process that 7 traditional owner groups around marine country agree to in regards to protocols and how people should engage. So, taking one process, adopting it, and streamlining it to be a bit more efficient. So, but I suppose the other side of this is that when a researcher comes from the departmental process and Section 17 undertake research, how can this process align with the departmental process to meet efficiency and streamline researchers in regards to giving them the permission and giving a research license. So maybe that's a conversation that moving forward, that how do we have that to streamline research, and sometimes research can be, someone wanting to go out there next week, but how does that align with the traditional owners' aspirations and so forth. So I think there's a few more conversations around how can we to work together, I suppose, to streamline this process with the department.
And we were talking a little bit before about the way that this the protocol's being put together, that it's specifically at the moment it was around saltwater because that was the brief that we had for this project. But because it's been developed by the groups and it's actually a process where it can be taken across to other areas, and the same of all of our products, the multiple evidence-based approach, and then also the framework. So what does it do? So just to give people a bit of on the left-hand side, you can't quite see the questions, but there's it's an online form that you can go and fill out, and it takes you through the steps. So there's an online form that if you're starting to think about a new research process, what are you doing? And through that online form, it actually asks you questions, and one of the questions refers you to the guide to researchers. So it says, okay, have you read this guide? Because this guide will actually help you fill out this this form for. And those forms are actually, they, like you said, they go to the groups, and it's about the first point of call when you want to think about doing some research. It gives them some initial information. They can read that information, see what you think, because a lot of the groups are saying, we get these proposals all the time, and we're getting people contacting us, and we don't really know. It takes us time to think about those, about what the project is. Have you thought about this? And so it just streamlines that approach. There's an initial bit of information that goes to the that's sent to each of the groups and to the main contact in the groups, and that main contact can then actually look at the proposal and start thinking about it, and then the guidelines actually talk you through that, about what that process is. So just to give you a, hope that's right, Gina, yell out if I've got it all wrong. No. And so basically the guidelines step you through a number of steps. So you'll see that they are actually practical guidelines. They actually take you through. So it talks about when you're preparing for your research, what you need to think about, how to do joint development and proposals, assessment and consultation, agreement brokerage, and then working on country, and then communicating results. So it's about relationship building throughout the whole process, and it's about starting with, okay, putting forward your research proposal to the groups that you're going to work with, and then work together on how that's going to look. And so there's there's a fair bit of detail, but I'm not, but they sort of, I suppose.
Yeah, what it does is form a collaborative relationship. Obviously, it meets some of your objectives as a researcher, but then obviously, it has to be, meets something that the traditional owners want to do as well. So, a lot of the groups have got healthy country plans, they've got targets that they want, that force the researcher to look a bit more specifically into the region and align their research with some of the aspirations that traditional owners have got in their healthy country plans. So it's a two-way win at the end of the day, and information is provided back in a way that it's palatable to the Indigenous community, so they understand the research findings. So it's sort of, it's common outcomes at the end.
I think I also created that environment we were talking about, like these guys, because their groups knew them and they'd worked with them before. When they get some money, they can go back and go, oh, that's good, this will get heard and get engaged. So creating those relationships and a two-way street. Oh, we know you want to work with some more. So
and I think that wheel was quite daunting, if you look at it, but I think once you've gone through it, you don't have to do it anymore. I think you're quite aware of the process.
It's just a checklist reminder that you might have forgotten things. And sitting behind these guidelines, sitting behind these guidelines as well is all of that information. So those healthy country plans, those things, you can access them. They're actually they show you where to get that information, where to go. So it's not, you're not starting from the very, it's a map of who you might, a lot of people who haven't been to the Kimberley go, oh, I'd like to go there and there, but who speaks to that country? Who I need to contact?
And obviously, you might be restrained by your resources with your research, but obviously there's groups out there with assets that can help, I suppose, in that, boats, vehicle transports, and the like. So it's sort of a win-win, and that, and if your research is more aligned to some of their targets, there might be more willing to sort of participate and in-kind contribution to that.
So this process now replace REACT process with the blessing of everybody, and where is it actually housed? Is it housed in the KLC, or where is that at? For researchers who want to do, someone brand new and they're wanting to do some research in Kimberley.
Like I said, it'd be good if the department, DBCA, the backend, adopts this process, because then it's done through the section as a researcher is applying for research in the Kimberley around marine research. That if it's going to be adopted into that process, then straight away you don't have to go to the KLC. You drop down. If you're doing research in this area, bang, it comes up with the healthy country plan, the group, the contact details. So it's sort of sideline, But I think that's something ideally we'd like to see.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's got, at the moment, the last meetings that we had, Gina just was getting agreements from all of the groups that this was the way that they wanted to go forward. So it's actually almost final, but not not quite final.
But
Is
two
Gina?
groups just to-
Yeah,
because
and
of
so,
ABC business and obviously they couldn't get that through the endorsement.
but the whole, yeah.
By the final meeting, yeah.
And so the whole idea is that KLC will adopt this as part, and the REACT process will become defunct. But and that they are going to take on this, and I suppose it needs a trial period. So there are a number of, for example, I know that Department of Water in the Kimberley region, one of the groups has approached them when they've actually were starting to do some research, and they said, hey, we've got these guidelines. We know that that's probably not quite, it doesn't quite fit what you're doing, but can you have a look at them and go through them? So Department of Water, and so they're starting to trial it with government departments as well and things like that. So, yep. And did Gina have something to say?
I've just done a phone a friend, and phone a friend said that it is held with the KLC, and the groups that are represented by the KLC, because obviously some groups aren't. The other three groups, they're going through the last process of them accepting if they like that process, because this is, although it was based on REACT to begin with, it's now outside. It's not REACT. It's not KLC's product. It's everyone's, the group's product. So that's the 7 groups that are represented. The next task will be go to other groups of the 11 saltwater countries. Say, you like this, you like working with this process and getting it out there further. So yes, online is housed within the KLC, but it's had accreditation from all those groups saying, and they'll have access.
Yeah.
So if you would ask anybody, if you wanted to do research, they would all hopefully in 6 months' time direct you to this process rather than
All those 7 country groups. Yeah,
Yes.
that's it,
Yeah.
So that's pretty much what. So Yawuru, Jawi down the South Eagle Beach, Yawuru, Jawi, Mangari, Warnabugama, Balangara. Yeah. So there's some that aren't quite there yet because they don't have the capacity to participate in the group, but they're sort of hopefully not.
Yeah, sorry.
Which is to drop 2 words, they're keywords, but they're make the document generic, is collaborative science on country. Is this a model or template that should be used or something equivalent to it for work on country, regardless of, our focus has been marine for the last 2 days. And, if that hasn't been thought about, it certainly should be.
That was then the reason that, we all talk about that and said essentially you could drop those words, and straight away right now those guidelines are guidelines really. It doesn't matter where you are working with groups on country, and you're right.
Yeah.
And I suppose because the project, it was developed for saltwater, the permissions have all been around saltwater, but I would recommend that anybody that's going to be working in the Kimberley and on country actually go through this process, even if the online form is, even if the online form is towards saltwater.
Yeah, definitely. And WAMSI was very interested in this and wanted to adopt it for the treasure or something. So
Yeah.
it has got that, I suppose, land team combined sort of the terrestrial and marine sort of process.
And I think that's what the group would like to going forward is, okay, we've got this, let's trial it a bit and expand it and say, yes, this is the way we want it. I think we're getting sort of towards the end, and so I don't have much time to talk, but I did a lot of talking yesterday. So I just wanted to make you aware of the part of the project that I was involved in, and I'll just put that to. So as I mentioned before, my background is I'm a UWA researcher. Most of my work in the Kimberley has been around freshwater, and I've worked with a number of the groups. I've done a lot of work in the freshwater space of adapting monitoring techniques for rangers, working with ranger groups to look at how to better manage freshwater for management plans, and trying to sort of bring Indigenous science and West Indigenous knowledge and science into that. And also I've trialled a number of Western science frameworks in the Kimberley. So I've had a bit of background around monitoring, and yesterday I sort of gave the talk yesterday was went into the details of that framework, but I just wanted to just show you here. The groups really wanted a regional framework because they knew that there's a lot of work going along in the Kimberley. A lot of the groups were doing work and not necessarily having the opportunity to talk about what techniques were working, what wasn't working, and also what was research monitoring and what's our long-term monitoring. So that's sort of regional, I suppose, a way forward in a regional approach. And so they really wanted to develop up a framework for that reason. Also, groups understand that what they're monitoring in their patch in terms of things like dugong, they can't make sense of that information unless they have a sort of a regional scale. And also the groups are asking to, part of this, the development of marine parks is, and I suppose it's more relevant here, is that, okay, we've got joint managed marine parks. And so when groups have to go and sit at our table and talk about what monitoring or what things that they would like to look at, that they had some information that was built from I suppose traditional owners up, and so that they had confidence in what it is that groups and groups have those healthy country plans at the local scale, but really this was okay at a regional scale. What are we interested in? And so we developed up a framework basically. I think it's probably time, is it? What's it? So this is the framework. It's based on a adaptive
Tell everyone.
Okay, tell everyone. Okay, so we just made sure that the framework built on existing work, the healthy country plans, like the guidelines say, go to the healthy country plans first. There's a lot of information that you can get from that initially. And we also reviewed reviewed and spoke to all of the groups and the rangers about the techniques that they were using. And then we tested the framework within the KISSP case study in order to see what bits work, and also what bits do we need a bit more capacity building in. And so here's the framework. The framework is, for most of you who've undertaken monitoring, it's just a common adaptive management framework. It identify what is important, what's threatening it, prioritise it, monitor, and then make sure you use that information to feed back into your monitoring.
Yeah, but I mean, look, for us, we're especially with Yawuru, we're having been charged to develop a customary hunting framework for rubber clay. It's very, we can't, and to manage those species, we need to know what they're doing from a regional scale, So how does their foraging starts between their rookeries and so forth. So, but then also from a traditional owner perspective, how can we come together as a region, share our data and information, and make informative management decisions around how we manage those migratory species? Because they don't have any boundaries. For us to manage them locally, we need to understand what they're doing in a regional perspective. So, so that's a reflective of regional and local, I suppose. So, bringing scientific data into sort of assist in the traditional knowledge sort of component as well. So, that's trying to.
And I would just say too that Beck's being very humble, and that it might look like a simple process, a simple diagram here, but the work that has gone on behind this to really build this this framework from the ground up and make it work for rangers is actually the sophisticated part. So I'd just say that. I brag on behalf of Rebecca.
And I suppose one of the main things we really wanted to do was not to put a framework on top of groups that are already at their maximum capacity in terms of what they're doing. We didn't want to say, here's a framework that you've got to go out and change the way you're doing things, but let's build on what you're doing locally. How can that feed into the framework and get groups? One of the main things about this framework as well, like you said, was making sure that those things like the values and the threats are built from the ground up, and the prioritisation process, but also talking groups through. I think Di Walker made a comment yesterday, that assessment phase, it's the one that's in monitoring hardly gets done, and it's not just from in an Indigenous space, it's in any monitoring space. So make sure that groups were aware that that they're very strong in sections of this process and sections of collecting monitoring data, but we need to strengthen some of those other areas. And so, as you can see, just to give you a bit of a background about what Bo means by the bottom up is even just in the identification of values across the region. So we looked at the regional values, and you'll see here that we've put the cultural practices, and that was, I suppose, our best way of showing that the cultural practices, they're linked to and need to be included in each of the other categories, the broad categories, because you can't, do you want to touch on that about culture? You can't separate cultural practices from.
I think the culture is everything. It's tied to everything. So the connection to all of those, I suppose, conservation targets, significant areas, basic livelihoods. They're all, I suppose, encompassing of cultural values.
And if you're going, and so the way forward for a framework, especially for Indigenous people, is to make sure that we recognise that included into the framework. And you'll see here also the threats. There's threats there that were common to that we sort of see from common to those people from Western science point of view. But there's also threats that that we don't think of. That it's just as important. Those threats, climate change. So threats that limit the ability of groups to undertake cultural practices were as highly ranked as those threats such as mining and climate change. So
yeah, and one, I suppose, example of that, Yawuru have been able to, because we've got a native title in a very built up urban environment, we share our country with a variety of uses. Robert Bay is very complex. We've got tourism, we've got cultural hunting happening, and we've got normal recreational fishermen. But what we've been able to do is through that is to have a zone where Yawuru can undertake their cultural activities in I suppose, in a bit of peace, I suppose, but we ask people to, in the plans, respect us in regards to our activities within that area. So yeah, and how do we, what does respect look like? It might be just being, mindful of the people that have that right to undertake that activity within that area.
And so, yeah, sorry, yeah. Sorry, no, that's great too.
No, so, it was really interesting. We had this conversation yesterday for a brief, but the way this fits in very well with the department's process going forward as well. I think they go hand in hand. Yeah. So you're referring here to the monitoring programs, where you're identifying values, threats, through a prioritisation process. There's a direct alignment there. So facilitating this process going into the departments, which is relatively easy.
Yeah. And probably the most difficult one that we've talked about, and you talked about that, touched on it yesterday, was actually so just to let you know, we've developed tools as we've been going through for each of the steps to assist the groups in moving forward, and some of those things are about getting groups to think about. There's been a real emphasis on measuring the values, monitoring the change in values. But if we don't put that into perspective, how do we, it's management effectiveness that essentially that groups want. They want to monitor to make sure that their management, that they're doing what they're managing, is having an effect. And if it's not, how do we change that? What do we need to do? That sort of thing. So really thinking about that and thinking about the questions rather than being driven by the monitoring tools that we as Western scientists have produced, like actually stepping back and saying, why do we need to use these tools to answer the things that we would like to? And I suppose the hardest one of those, so sort of building up some conceptual models we did around starting to, so you can incorporate cultural and ecological threats, etc. So you can start thinking about how are these things impacting and what are the indicators we'd like to choose. But the prioritisation, I think I skipped over it, but the prioritisation process is probably one of the hardest ones at the moment that are different across the regions. I mean, from a point of view that, and so when I'm talking about the prioritisation process, these guys have been through that process just recently. And
it's, I suppose, as I alluded yesterday, we went through it as previously was undertaken by the Marine Science Branch in regards to prioritisation process of implementation of the plan, but in true joint management, I wanted traditional owners to be part of that process as well, and it never was taken. That was never undertaken with the traditional owners above the 26 parallel line. So it was a bit of, I suppose, 6 months period of looking at the language within that document, changing it so it could be palatable to the Indigenous groups. So over 6 months working with the Marine Park coordinators from Balangara and Yawuru, looked at that monitoring process and changed it and undertook 5 Yawuru men through that process. And the outcomes that, when after the department and the joint management departments undertook that was quite ironic that, turbines and dugongs and that were on high on the list of water quality, sedimentation, and intertidal zone. I think that was incompatible with the department. So it was quite an interesting outcome through that process. Yeah. So I mean, this is what we're calling multi-evidence-based approach and joint management base.
And thinking about that in terms of the way forward, we were talking about that yesterday, is now that we've got that, but how do we now make sure that we incorporate those cultural values as well and try and get them into there? And so I just really wanted one of the main things that came out of this project is we did a massive stock take of what research, what monitoring is actually going on in the Kimberley, what are groups using, what techniques are they using, what are they using it for, what are they, who's using it? So that groups can actually come to this toolbox and they can say, okay, we actually want to answer this question. Where do we go from here? We know that there's a number of monitoring tools. We know that we can go across and say who's using that tool. We can contact those groups, see how they're going with it. Is it a tool that you want to adopt? So that's the one thing this toolbox allows to do, but it's also allowed us to actually and also get groups to start thinking about what's research monitoring and what's monitoring for longer term, because that's what a lot of groups were involved in, a lot of monitoring, but which parts of that monitoring will be an endpoint answering a question and will be something that they can stop doing in terms of their monitoring, and what are those things that they want to go on in the future. And also the opportunity to start bringing in some of those techniques, those social science techniques, I suppose we call them. I don't know what it's a bit, but those techniques that actually can start to actually, it isn't just about a Western science tool that's actually collecting this information, but are there tools that we can help to actually make sure that Indigenous knowledge, so that there is a multiple evidence-based approach. So you can use multiple evidence to
look at the Yawuru joint benefit plans, the cultural value side of things. The bottom of that, the measure is Yawuru satisfied. So the Yawuru prescribed body corporate satisfied that people are rights to country or living cultural landscape is protected. But how do we measure that? So we're looking at having a research social scientist, I suppose, look at those measurables. Doing some work around ecosystem services as well, around the measurable around that. So I think we're pretty close to, what is that indicator of satisfaction or health from a social perspective. It's a bit of a qualitative and quantitative sort of research, but it's something that we're looking at the social side of things about the measurability of from a business perspective.
And I imagine from a department perspective, this sort of information is important, because understanding what groups are actually doing. Also, where are some tools that are missing to answer some of the questions, help answer some of the questions that groups want to use, and where do we need to? There's some tools. One of the biggest, and I suppose the most difficult part of the project was, I think there's a lot behind it. There's electronic stuff. Was this analysis phase. So for all of those tools that ranger groups are using at the moment, there was only 2 of all of those tools that actually have some tools themselves to help ranger groups to analyse or look at the data. So we're getting a lot of data collected and a lot of stuff collected, but it's not actually being looked at, or the groups can't actually look at or aren't using it for management. And
and I think that's from a perspective of us in the joint management space. We asked the department, all the data we've been collecting, can you tell us what the current status of those ecological assets are? And I think so. There's a lot of, I think the data collection side of things within the department needs to be, I suppose, relooked, and we think about, I suppose, in the space of joint management, because the traditional owners will be wanting to know how, our return on our investment through the joint management programs, I suppose, is how does the information that we've been collecting, what is it actually telling us to the health of that country, and not for the sake of monitoring something over time and finding out that it's almost to an extinction, but so it's where those indicators come in and tell us that things are either declining or on the trend up. So
So I think I'll leave it there. And so that was, and we've obviously got this now. I mean, we've written a report as well about what we think of the way forward with these products from our point of view. So that's also available, and each of these reports will be publicly available within days.
Hours,
in hours perhaps even. so yeah.
Recognise we can continue to
Thank
say
you.
But
if anyone does need to go, I'm aware of the time.
Yeah.
If you just snuff out for lunch and coming back, please feel free. And thank you very much for coming. All of these products will be available on the web shortly. And the presentation these guys gave yesterday, it was also recorded. So that'll be available too, with all the other presentations from the symposium. So that's about it. If you need to go, thank you very much for coming. want to stay and ask questions, feel free. We'll continue to be.
Dave, have you got a question? Yeah.
Dave,
Yeah, it's probably a question for Bo and Dean.
Thanks, guys.
I'm always incredibly impressed when I go to days like yesterday and see the results of the physical modelling. It's so believable and so incredible. The modelers yesterday said that that's just not so useful for informing management decisions. And I'm always left feeling very underwhelmed when I see physical models of biological systems, because I had a 10-year career at the Ag Department as a research scientist in the modelling section. We were trying to model pasture growth, and that's about as simple as it gets, and that is unbelievably difficult to do. So how we tend to deal with complexity is we throw it at the modeler, but the modelers themselves are telling us that the biological, social, ecological parts of those models aren't particularly believable. On the other side of the coin, we have Aboriginal knowledges that have been established over 50,000 years, where things have changed, but the rate of change has been quite slow. And so the Aboriginal processes have been able to accommodate those changes because they've been changing at a very slow rate. The question I have, and it's a comment as much as it is a question, I'm very excited by this process of bringing together the two knowledge systems, because I think we have an urgent need to bring together these knowledge systems to start to get our head around the changes that are coming with climate change. Ocean acidification is going to favour potentially harmful diatoms over, dinoflagellates, NSP organisms, Ciguatera, over diatoms. That's changing now. Sea level rise is obviously a problem. Ocean heating is a problem. Every time our coral assemblage bleaches, it purges a huge amounts of nutrients into the water that the algae can then get hold of. So for me, how is this blending of the two knowledge systems going to deal with this complexity and uncertainty that's happening at such a rate that's exceeding traditional Aboriginal ways in incorporating uncertainty? And it's happening at such a scale with so many interrelated things that even the modelling isn't going to give us the management decisions we need. So I'm excited that it's happening, and I think that's the only way forward. But I'm also very nervous about the rates of change and our ability to get ahead of that and to put the correct management measures in place. So could you comment on that?
Do you want to go first, or? Yeah. I mean, it's a great
I would have
question.
done that too. That's yours, Bo.
We actually always do this to Bo. He goes, oh, who's up next? And we both go.
Well, I do love this question. Maybe it is a longer conversation, but it's an important one because, so I think that issue around what is Indigenous knowledge is, it's not just the content that's shared about changes in the landscape or about information about a particular species and its life cycle or those sorts of things. Indigenous people have a way of observing change in the environment that is quite different, and it's linked, it's inseparable from the management practices, if we call them that, themselves. So you've got this sort of live back and forth between practice and knowledge, practice and knowledge. It's very current, and people are very adaptive because of that. So I think it's going to be a challenge. There's some really good research papers globally coming from places like the Amazon that are showing that environmental change is a real struggle for Indigenous knowledge at the moment because it's happening so quickly. But in terms of making management decisions, it's a much better tool. I mentioned this in the Broome workshop. In the report that I wrote, there's a quote from Bob Johannes, who was a researcher he was working around Palau in the 1970s. And he observed that every single, in the 1970s, conservation tool that Western scientists and managers were using was already in place in traditional governance structures. And that was because people were, Johannes uses this kind of provocative term of dataless management. and it's not saying that people are not using information or knowledge to make decisions, but they're not collecting quantitative stats and analysing it to make a decision about management. So how much knowledge do we need before we can make a decision about what's good for the environment or not? And so I think Indigenous people have a fairly, at least an interesting relationship between knowledge and practice and policy and all those sorts of things that is potentially a lot quicker at adapting than Western science.
Yeah.
That's a long but short.
Yeah, that was good.
response. Yeah,
Just to add further, can't we learn off the videos
totally.
of
Yeah.
the, considering that they've gone through a climate change in recent time, 8,000 years ago, and survived. So do we necessarily have to impose Western science, forward thinking in management of marine environment and adaptation policy that has occurred previously?
Yeah, I suppose that you know, I think if you look at that, so adaptation thing is
Yeah.
you know, there's those external drivers and pressures are actually increasing more now as well. So I think that adaptation is, you know, obviously everything's sort of changing at a greater rate. But obviously, Indigenous knowledge is very localised too as well, and we have to be mindful of that knowledge is pertinent to that group's area. As well, so and that can be quite regional, localized. You know that knowledge. So when we talk about knowledge, it's the common that having to bring the knowledge from across the region, I suppose, so, as well. So you know to get that enriched picture.
Yeah. And probably combining the two knowledge
Well,
systems plus more.
Well, you know that's where, you know, if we look at
gives you the
us
most
having
power.
to develop a customer having framework, we want to bring in the turtle data, you know, from Tony and the seagrass data, and then, you know, to make some informed management decisions and based around traditional knowledge. You know, we know when we used to hunt, when the right hunting season was, you know, right time of the year, gestation. So you start to bring in the seasonal knowledge component, that traditional ecological knowledge, and then you bring in the scientific data, and then you make informed decisions around it. It's just not based around that solely traditional knowledge. So it's a combination about building collaboration, building capacity, and sharing knowledge. You know, so that's just one, I suppose, you know, case study that you could bring the combination of knowledge together.
Right, so dialogue. It implies that there's different views, and we're sharing those views, perhaps, within a respectful sort of framework. Now, when it comes to agreements, that's fine. But when there's a point of disagreement, and I'm thinking of scientists amongst themselves disagreeing all the time, would the protocols envision a way forward that is respectful for managing disagreements?
Resolution or dispute resolution?
I think
So I'll have another go at this, but so in our work, there's a whole, we assume that there's a need for consensus before we make any decision in a group. And what we say is that that dissensus is actually a really good thing within our group. And if we engage in our work in a collaborative way, but underpinned by a good faith approach, we talk about opening our hearts or having that sense of liaison, then the differences actually, they can be a problem in terms of moving forward, but we're all committed to this cause together. So like any group of people, a marriage perhaps, you know, people will have differences over the long run, but because there's a commitment to each other, there's a way of working through those differences. So we encourage difference, we encourage dissensus. We see that as a strength of the multiple evidence-based approach. Doing it takes patience and time and sensitivity and really good dialogue, good communication, but it's possible. And I think KISSP is an example of where we've actually been able to do it.
would have been interesting if you could have sat in some of those workshops. You can imagine someone who came from Western science point of view, I don't know, social scientist, whatever. I mean, you're not even that, but so not even that. But no, I didn't want to pigeonhole you into that. You're more than that. You're more than that. But so very different disciplines. And we sat in that room and we had differences. And we challenged each other, and we challenged the way we thought about check, and that's checking each other as well on those things. And yeah, but like you said, if it's in good faith, then that's, you know, there's a movement.
You and Chris Nutt have the same sort of relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's that good collaborative relationship, but it's challenging each other. And I think that's the other good thing, is that if you've got people on the other side that are willing to try and explore, and change takes time, but I think if you've got people that are genuinely committed to trying new processes and step outside of the boundary a little bit, I think it's an integral part to, you know, good collaborative relationships. About trusting each other, because I said, trust me, brother, will, you know, the outcome of this, you know, will be much better for us. And, you know, 6 months later, we went through the process, and it was a high five moment, you know, but it's that 6 months of hard, you know, trying to, you know, stretch the mind to try and incorporate this new process. But I think if there's time allowed in this process, if there's permitted, these are the things that can be achieved, I think. Because mindful that he has to follow a departmental process, I'm giving him something that's saying, well, no, look, we need to change that process, and he, you know, trying to get some buy-in from the department to allow that little bit of extra flexibility in the time. So I think when things come off like that, you know, it reflects that if we have enough time, these things can be achieved. So it's just trying to reshape the current processes within the department that might allow that better collaborative approach. Sort of,
it's interesting that you mentioned Bob Johannes's work in the Pacific, but like when European people came to Australia, and the way Aboriginal people had sorted out this thing is it's enforced sustainability, and the surviving models are the ones you saw, and the elements are quite big. The society that we are driven by now is an invasive species interruption phase that is non-sustainable. So just recently someone published a little paper about investment in conservation that said put a bit more money in, you can actually stop the tide a bit, but they will converge again shortly. Yeah. So some of the models are terribly wrong. Yeah. Altogether. I talked with someone who went to the Kimberley to talk to people about saltwater resource stuff in 1985, before native time. Lewis the Seaman was about. Some of the old fellas that I talked to a long time, people know who I am. And if you're up in Darwin, you've met Ben, Jawi, and Libby, who's one of my relatives, who worked for John Altman, and 20 years after I'd been doing this, and she was doing this work there, and I said, well, when we go to Nullarbor, we'll see people that know about the connection of turtles to Western Australia, because I had preferentially people from the Nambung Peninsula try to get them to do what we can do with science that you couldn't possibly know as hunters, but people. The other thing is that we spend a lot of time taking old fellas to lunch and talking about where you go and what you're doing and why do you know this or why is that hobby. And we're not stupid. You have to go and talk to people as people with respect to and I did this in the fisheries and wildlife department middle 1980s, and I only went there when I asked the director if I go to do this, but it was all to do about the spectacle of Aboriginal people butchering dugongs at the beach in July. But right in front of the startled and not necessarily.
Well, I'm still dealing with that issue.
But I did one of the things that I did with this was the idea that what are kids going to do at school? Why do you do maths or something? You know, I mean, they did it eventually in the Nambung project there, but try to do it in there. The language stuff, you can get an active tempo and that sort of thing, the cultural thing. What do you value? If you want to know that people know about it, well, off the Nambung Peninsula, people know underwater. Steve Davis up in the Territory got people to tell him what was underwater, and he went out there and mountains. And it was exactly what people said. So it wasn't enough. Where the resources for the church and the coming thing, they're out to sea. But people know. I mean, every people come here to people who walk at Watching Up and they, well, European people didn't understand about sea level changes and all this sort of thing there, but people had to, it's all there.
Yeah. I think this whole discussion could continue on as long as you want. We might finish off this session and you guys can continue chatting. We're going to have a bit of a discussion, not with all the projects, as you know, we have a bit of a chat afterwards about what's coming out of it and how we take the next step forward. So, but for those of us who remain, we put your hands together for the guys.
Thank you.
I've been hearing it twice.